Today's session, Leading in Crisis with Deval Patrick. Deval Patrick is co-director of the Center for Public Leadership and a professor of practice at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also a senior advisor to Bain Capital and co-chair of American Bridge 21st Century Foundation, a progressive political action committee. He is the founder and from April 2015 to December 2019 was managing partner of Bain Capital Double Impact, a growth equity fund that invests in commercial businesses for both competitive financial returns and positive social impact. From January 2007 to January 2015, he served as governor of Massachusetts. He's been a senior executive in 2 Fortune 50 companies, a partner in 2 Boston law firms, and by appointment of President Bill Clinton, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the United States Justice Department. He is a Rockefeller Fellow, a Crown Fellow of the Aspen Institute, and the author of 2 books. Mr. Patrick earned his AB cum laude from Harvard College and his JD from Harvard Law School. Thank you so much for joining us today, Deval. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Erica, for the warm welcome, and good morning or evening, as the case may be. It's good to be with everyone, even in this sort of disembodied way. Thanks for joining the webinar today. I was asked to talk a little bit about what I intend to teach as a newbie here on the faculty, and candidly, I have not entirely resolved that. I have mainly been focused on how we as a Center for Public Leadership can better define what it is we mean to produce, what sort of outcomes we want to deliver, and how collaboratively with faculty and staff and indeed alumni, we can take our program to the next level. So having spent not enough time yet on the subject of my teaching, I told Dean Iles in haste that I would speak about leading through crises, thinking I would talk about the experience of being governor during the bombing at the Boston Marathon in 2013. But I want to speak about leadership in crisis instead, because in the United States, at least, democracy is in trouble. And a series of failures of leadership, I believe, is at the root of that trouble. I really promise to be brief, both because I much prefer conversation than lecturing, and because there will still be time left to take your questions about the marathon bombing or anything else you prefer. In my opinion, there are 2 profound challenges facing American democracy today. The first challenge is how to make it function, how to make it straightforward and transparent to register, stay registered, vote, and have that vote counted. This challenge has gained attention from political figures, advocates, and the media in recent months because of the 19 states with Republican-led legislatures that have enacted new laws to frustrate, complicate, and when they want to, overturn the vote. You'll also be familiar with the recent failure of Congress, in particular the Senate, as well as the Supreme Court, to right those wrongs. In truth, these new measures are part of a larger, prolonged strategy to encumber American democracy. Other measures include hyperpartisan gerrymandering, the widespread purging of registration rolls, the flood of money, much of it dark, into politics and policymaking, the persistent and recently successful efforts to weaken the Voting Rights Act. Disinformation amplified by social media is another device in wide use in support of this strategy. They are all parts of a fundamentally anti-democratic strategy methodically pursued over time, largely by so-called movement Republicans. Now, let me just say, I am a proud Democrat, and that may sound like a partisan jab, but I'm not the sort of Democrat who thinks you have to hate Republicans to be a good Democrat. It is an objective fact based in evidence that part of Republican electoral strategy for many years now has been to constrain Democratic participation. It's almost as if at some level, Republicans have decided that they can't win a fair fight. And while this trap was methodically laid over decades, Democrats have often seemed naive or flat-footed about what was happening. I'm sure there's a whole semester's worth of leadership lessons in this anti-democratic history, culminating in the Senate hiding behind the filibuster rule late last year when given the chance to fix our voting rules. But that's just the first of the big challenges facing our democracy, the one concerning how to make democracy function, the one that has gotten the most attention. The second big challenge is how to make democracy matter. Fully 1/3 of eligible Americans simply don't vote, not because, or not just because it's harder than it should be to do so, but because they are not convinced that it matters. The consequences of that are deeply troubling, and yet we hardly say a word about that, how to make the vote meaningful. And I want to try to unpack this in a personal way. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, much of that time on public assistance, in a crowded tenement, in overcrowded and under-resourced schools. I got a break when I was 14 to go to boarding school outside of Boston, and then on to college and eventually to law school here at Harvard. I've served, as you heard in the introduction, as a civil rights and business lawyer, as an executive in 2 Fortune 50 companies, as an investor, an entrepreneur, and a 2-term governor. Now I'm called professor. My story in many ways is perhaps like a lot of yours, of not being defined by my circumstances of birth. It's a story not told often enough in this country, but it was once told more often in the United States than any other place on earth. That's an American story. But the American story, the American dream, is further and further out of reach for more and more Americans, and that ought to concern us all. For most of the last 40 plus years, real income has been stagnant at best or in decline for the overwhelming majority of Americans. Until recently, we stopped investing in the transportation, education, housing, healthcare, and other public initiatives that enable private investment and personal ambition. The myth of trickle-down economics and the narrative of radical individualism have been the predominant policy orthodoxy in the United States, with foreseeable, widespread, and deeply disruptive results. It's important to understand these realities as widespread, not limited to racial or ethnic minorities, who are sometimes, I think, the foil of the reactionary right and the excuse of many more to look away. See, I always knew there were other kids on the South Side just as creative and ambitious as me who never got their chance. Now I see those kids everywhere. I always knew when the steel mills closed on the South Side that folk felt abandoned and even betrayed by a nameless, faceless, short-sighted economy. Now I sense that feeling everywhere. I've always known what it was like to have opioids fill the vacuum because they moved into our own home. Now they've moved in everywhere. The cheery economic indicators have rarely told the whole story. Inflation was reportedly low until recently, but not if you were paying for healthcare or rent or college tuition. Unemployment is low today so long as you do count both or all three of the low-wage jobs so many folks do just to survive, and to which many a post-pandemic worker just refuses to return. The poor have been stuck in poverty for a long time, and the middle class are 1 or 2 paychecks away from being poor and deeply anxious about it. All of this was true before the pandemic made many of these realities so much harder to overlook. I believe we face this second big challenge to our democracy because, from the perspective of many, many Americans, democracy is failing to deliver more of the changes Americans across the spectrum want in their everyday lives. Today, white, rural, working class folks experience the same economic insecurity and social isolation, the same suicide and addiction rates as Black people have experienced for generations. Many feel the same anxiety, fear, and even anger at how those issues become issues at election time and then seem to vanish in between. Ask yourself what the average voter sees when they consider what democracy has produced. Nobody serious in either political party believed trickle-down economics, including its central myth that tax cuts stimulated growth, was anything but voodoo economics until Ronald Reagan won on that platform. And then everybody, including a lot of Democrats, embraced it. Nobody seriously believed that mass incarceration or that effectively criminalizing poverty would make us safer until polls showed that appearing tough on crime appealed to so-called undecided voters. And then the political class embraced it. These are just two examples of how conventional political wisdom persists despite common sense and decades of evidence that tax cuts do not create jobs and tough on crime policies have not made us safer. That's before we even get to the broad majority of Americans who want stronger gun safety laws or reasonable access to abortion services. And herein lies the kind of sustained bipartisan failure of leadership I'm talking about. The loss of confidence in democracy as a path to change derives from our leaders' relentless focus on the next election or news cycle or the next poll instead of the next generation. And by the way, that preoccupation with the short term has been a prevalent and has been, I think, as prevalent and as consequential in the private sector as it has been in the public sector. Indeed, we have lots in the public sector, lots of ambitious office holders and would-be office holders who want to have the leadership job but not do it. I am admittedly influenced by lessons from my old neighborhood, two in particular that have shaped my own life and deeply affect how I think about leadership. One is about community, like the one I grew up in, where every child was under the jurisdiction of every adult on the block, and how membership in community is about seeing your stake in your neighbor's dreams and struggles as well as your own. The other lesson is about generational responsibility. Same one I'll bet every one of us learned from our grandparents, that we are supposed to do what we can in our time to leave things better for those who come behind us. And I don't think I'm different from most others from whatever background who have lived their own version of the American dream. So when I think about the leadership we need for the future of our democracy to be brighter, I cannot and I do not escape those lessons. Yes, we need laws and rules and norms that truly encourage and reflect our respect for participatory democracy, that make it easier to register, to vote, and to have that vote count. But to address the challenge of voter apathy, of making voting meaningful, we need a different kind of leadership. Leaders who ask us, indeed, who challenge us to turn to each other instead of on each other, and who are prepared to spend political capital, not just accumulate it, because that's what it takes to leave things better for those who come behind. We need leaders who will focus more on what's right about their own proposals than on what's wrong with the other sides, who engage us on why this or that program or reform matters to enabling the society and future we crave. Leaders who model a politics that says we don't have to agree on everything before we can work together on anything. We need leaders willing to call out and to reject the false choices that have become the diet staple of so much of our politics today. Leaders who remind us that we don't have to hate business to work for social justice, that we don't have to crash the economy to have a livable planet, that we don't have to demean the outcast and the vulnerable to secure the border, or to hate police to believe Black Lives Matter. We need serious, purposeful, authentic leaders who get close to regular people, not just consultants and donors, who listen closely to regular people, not just polls, and who convey by their words and their deeds that they are about trying to leave things better. I'm not talking about leaders who are merely transactional, folks without values or conviction, far from it. I'm all for leaders who are woke, as they say. But in the words of Anand Giridharadas, we need to be woke and still leave room for the still waking. That's not just a better way to govern, though it surely is. It's the only way to restore meaning to our democracy, to invite citizens to take a chance on their own civic and political future. And by the way, for you skeptics out there, it's also a way to win and to deserve to win. These are the kinds of leaders who have been in short supply and that we aim to cultivate and prepare at the Harvard Kennedy School through the Center for Public Leadership. Principled, effective leaders who, through scholarship, classroom learning, experiential learning, and exposure to living examples are prepared and inspired to contribute meaningfully to the long-term public good. And by the way, in whatever sector they choose. And I look forward to your support and encouragement as we do. I hope that's enough context for our conversation. Thank you again for having me, and I look forward to your questions, comments, and advice.
Great, thank you so much. You can submit your questions via the Q&A function, or you can raise your hand and we will get to as many live questions as we can. First question.
Erica, you're going to manage the questions, or
I'm going to take care of it. I'll send you the questions, so you don't have to worry about that.
Okay.
We have a couple of questions, a group of questions around environmental justice. So I'm going to kind of combine these so we can, again, continue to get to as many as we can. Someone is asking about the disparity between constitutional rights, but promise to people to have environmental justice linked to democratic freedom in certain parts of the world. Should we, as a democratic society, integrate environmental justice more deeply into our legal frameworks of our society? And also a quote from the John Lewis speech at the March on Washington, that there's no time left to be patient. So can we apply his words to the environmental injustice that occurs?
Yeah, I mean, in many respects, I would say when it comes to the environmental crisis, and is there a name associated with that, or should I just?
It looks like Azan.
Azan?
Yes.
So to Azan and to the others you were trying to aggregate into that question, I think in many respects, the environmental crisis by its nature requires an urgency. We are past the point of trying to avoid. We are at the point now, I think, of trying to mitigate. And one of the incredible phenomena and opportunities that I see is that there's a whole generation that's put a sort of collective foot down on that point. As I read and study the Constitution, I'm going to separate that, Azan, from the question of as I read and study the courts. But as I read and study the Constitution, justice is inherent, not just process, but actual outcomes is inherent in much of the founding values and is achievable through the existing language. What we have been doing, I think, for a long time now is in our courts is bleaching justice right out of the law. I mean, you have a court today that you talk about environmental justice. You have a court today that has basically read the purposes of the 14th, 15th, 13th, well, 14th to 15th amendments anyway, right out of the law. So we do need justices, and there are many great candidates and some judges who understand this, but we need justices who are, in my view, who are true originalists, meaning they actually do pay attention to the founding principles and to the language that was that helped interpret to the words and the records that helped interpret the language at the time, and not the kind of and not the originalists in name that we have today, who frankly, reading all kinds of things in the Constitution that were never intended to be there. And just one example, which is top of mind right now, is an individual right to bear arms. Doesn't exist anywhere in the words of the Constitution. Doesn't exist anywhere in the debate around the Constitution. Yet somehow or other that was inferred by so-called originalists. So Your question is, should environmental justice be more marbled, if you will, more inherent in the way we think about justice? I completely agree, and that should be pursued urgently. And I think there are a lot of really, really good advocates who are doing that in the courts right now.
Thank you. We will take a live question now. Avner, can you unmute yourself?
Hello.
Hi, Avner.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Or when I was a CEO of Early Sense. I don't know why my video is not on, but anyway, really appreciate you talking about this important topic. My question is, you talked about the kind of leadership that's needed, and I think that's agreed by everyone. The challenge is that our system does not support necessarily those leaders being successful in elections and moving forward and getting to the top. Are there any specific changes that you see that we need in the system in order to get the kind of leadership you're talking about to actually be successful in elections?
So I think, first of all, it isn't. I would respectfully disagree that we don't have leaders of that kind who are involved today and who are competitive and winning elections. But I think we have a lot of folks who feel discouraged by the system, and there are reasons to feel discouraged by the system. So a couple of changes I would make. I mean, I alluded to the ways in which we have encumbered access to the ballot itself, because I think that the kind of leadership I'm talking about is something that a whole lot of us crave, but it is made so hard to vote in so many ways and places that nowhere near do we get the engagement that is necessary. I mean, for example, we have all these new rules in a number of southern states. I'm thinking of Georgia in particular, where they are organizing like mad at the grassroots to overwhelm these new barriers, to educate people so that they are prepared. Because we need enough of that. We need enough of our own civic engagement, Avner, and to bring others along in order to elect the leaders who then have the mandate to make some of the changes we're talking about. I think money is a huge problem in politics. We've got, what did I read? Something like 50 or 60% of a House member or a senator's time is spent raising money for the next election. Imagine that. It always blows my mind, and maybe this is that I don't fully understand the rules of the Congress, that the body seems unable to do two big things at the same time, and that there's always this debate about, or always this commentary about how it's hard to get floor time for things. There are all kinds of changes in rules and tradition that would help. The filibuster is, I would say I was slow, for example, to think that the filibuster was something we needed to change. I've come to understand that the filibuster comes from is motivated. It has sort of smelly origins. Let me put it that way. It was developed and exercised mainly to prevent the very laws that would make it possible for somebody like me to participate fully in American life. Why it is we would defer to that, especially when we're talking, as recently happened in the case of voting reform, especially when, why we would defer to an undemocratic rule when democracy itself was the subject matter is mind-blowing. And then I think that I mentioned the emphasis on money. So I think those are some of the rules I would change. But I think we have to encourage folks who want to be leaders that they don't have to abide by the conventional wisdom on how to become a leader in order to become a leader. And I hadn't run for anything before. You think of Massachusetts, maybe if you don't live here, as a reliably blue state. In fact, there are more unenrolled independents than there are registered Democrats and registered Republicans combined. People don't buy 100% of what either party is selling here or anywhere else, for that matter. Our politics is mostly about insider and outsider. And I hadn't run for anything before, and I was an outsider, and the insiders had a choice, so we had to go about it a different way. And I think there were things we did in my first election that candidate Obama borrowed and took to another level in his election. We borrowed some of his stuff in my reelect, and he borrowed that back and improved on it for his reelect. And people are doing that, and there are organizations organizing to find capable people who bring a sense of service to the work and showing them new ways to get to achieve an opportunity to serve, and then supporting them in office. And the last thing I'll say is this. I think I was slow to figure out, Avner, that all these jobs, or being a candidate for these jobs, was some combination of substance and performance art. And it felt to me like the performance art sort of demeaned the substance in some way, and so I needed to not do that. Nowadays, it's all performance art. It's like substance be damned. And in a way that the feels to me like the electorate has become kind of so accepting of that we judge candidates on how well they perform rather than on how well they balance substance and performance art. And I'm really worried about that, and I don't know how to turn that around.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And kind of building on that, we have a question from Anna, who says, we hear a lot about the dangers of identity politics to building a winning political coalition, but many people feel like they've been excluded from the American dream because of their identities, such as their race, gender identity, etc. What advice or insights do you have about how to reconcile this tension?
Well, I think that's one of, I mentioned Anna in my opening, this notion of false choices. I think that's a perfect example of false choices. I think anybody who comes to a candidacy or to office with the view that they just have to put together a coalition of interest groups is sort of missing the job. I mean, we have I don't mean to just make this personal, but we have a relatively small proportion of the population in Massachusetts who are Black. I was never going to win that way. Just by identifying. On the other hand, I certainly didn't want to win without the community of Black voters. And a lot of those voters, by the way, are exactly the voters I was trying to describe in my opening remarks, people who feel like it doesn't matter. And so I had to go engage them and engage others. And when folks would ask me whether of Black communities around the Commonwealth or elsewhere, whether I was excited about trying to become the first Black governor of the Commonwealth. I mean, yes, that was huge, but I wasn't trying to become the governor of Black people in the same way I wasn't trying to become the governor of the Democrats. That you got a servant leadership, I think, means understanding you have to serve the people who voted for you and the ones who didn't. And that doesn't mean sort of diluting your conviction but it means paying attention. It means listening. It means taking the time and showing the respect of showing up and explaining yourself to people who you presume, if you are stuck in that, interest group politics thing, that already disagree with you. And I had a bunch of people who said, I'm a Republican, or I'm going to vote for you anyway, or I don't agree. I remember I got a wonderful note from someone who said, I don't agree with a single thing you said, but I believe you bring good faith to it, and we haven't had that kind of leadership, so I'm going to vote for you. So I think that is there to be done. I totally get that there are ways in which we need our leaders to pay special attention to the people who have felt left out. And the point I'm trying to make is that you might be surprised, Anna, that an awful lot of people share that sense of being left out, who think it's only about the group they occupy. Because that dynamic of insider and outsider politics that I described here in Massachusetts is, in fact, I think, a dynamic all over the country.
Thank you. We'll take another live question. Bonita, you unmute yourself.
Hi, Bonita.
Hi. Do you know?
Again, I'm only seeing a photograph, a beautiful one, but a photograph and not a video.
Thank you. Do you know, I just wanted to say, when I was coming up, I went to an HSBCU. I didn't know I could attend Harvard, and kudos to you. But as an African American in corporate America, what I try to do and try to remember in terms of a legacy is that we have such a dichotomy now between the haves and the have-nots and the forgottens. So I wanted to know if you could kind of comment on that. I think corporate America, sometimes their corporate responsibility does not see that. But what I'd like you to comment on is how, as African Americans, we can develop a legacy to remember the forgotten.
I love that. I love that question. You know, the short-termism that I talked about as a phenomenon I see in public life, I think has been an unhelpful, even destructive one, is something I see in spades and have seen in spades in the private sector as well. You know, focused on the next quarter, and sometimes sacrificing long-term interests of the enterprise instead of, you know, long-term value. That's really what we were trying to show. And in the investment fund I founded, that if you take a longer view of value, you can actually invest in mission-driven founders and companies that need capital scale just like anybody else, and have that sense of purpose and that sense of responsibility to all stakeholders intact, not just intact, but actually have that deliver a value premium. And I think this whole move, and if this is language that means anything to you, Bonita, or if it's not, say so, this whole move away from shareholder primacy to stakeholder primacy, to stakeholder capitalism, that you are thinking both about the investors, but you're also thinking about the community, you're thinking about the employees, you're thinking about your suppliers and so on. That is a much more sustainable form of capitalism. I say this as a capitalist, and it is right on trend alongside the other ways that this generation coming is demanding. These are secular trends and really, really important ones. I think that on how Black executives in particular, or Black people in business in particular, can, it's interesting. You know, I can't think of the number of times I was invited to some event, some fancy dinner, some club to play golf, which I don't do well. A lot of people who see me play would say that's not golf. When I'm very, very conscious that the people who are serving me, who are taking the car, who are, clipping the lawn, are people who look like me, and the people in the foursome are not. And I try to live my life, because I do think there's power in example. I try to live my life by acknowledging and seeing those people, not just, kind of the secret nod, but actually engaging with people who are not on the same level, if that's what it is, as the folks in that golf foursome. And I think it sometimes, and I have found, and I've been told, it sometimes calls out the behavior of some of my colleagues who are not Black and how they have been looking past or looking through the folks who make it possible for us to do the stuff we do, whether it's playing around a golf, frankly, just driving a business. So I think there is something about, I mean, I don't need to speak about all the programs and undertakings. You know, a lot of promises were made in 2020 after the videotape you meant just that despicable murder was displayed, but there has to be some accounting for that to see whether people actually kept the commitments that they made. I know there are a number of people working on that. So those are a couple of things that come to mind.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we'll go to Shanika.
Shanika, hi.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Or afternoon. Thank you so much. I actually just had a son that graduated in the class of 2022 from Harvard College. So
congratulations.
I am a fan. I am elected here in North Carolina in the capital county, Wake County. I'm a Wake County commissioner, vice chair of the board this year.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you so much. And as we look at moving forward from this crisis of COVID and a pandemic, you mentioned spending money on capital. So I'm just wondering how you weigh and then make the choice between helping vulnerable populations with immediate needs. I know we've done some work with the federal government around rent and utility help and those kinds of things, but also addressing future needs like building transit systems like microtransit and bus rapid transit, or expanding greenways and open space, which is for the mental and physical health of all the communities, especially those. So how do you make those choices, especially when we've got limited resources and we're all facing this inflation and high cost moving forward from the pandemic?
So there is no simple question, no simple answer to that, Shanika, as you well know, because you're having to make those choices. I will say the infrastructure bill that the president signed is huge and a great opportunity. It's frustrating to me a little bit that so much of it was done by block grants and so little with real direction. As a local official, I like that, but I have also seen other examples where local decisions are not made with a view to striking the kind of balance I think you're getting at.
Right.
So, for example, when we were trying to do transportation investment, we were purposefully geographically. We paid a lot of attention to geographic equity, because a lot of our transportation money over the decades has been spent in the neighborhood around Beacon Hill, where the Capitol is. Mm-hmm. A lot less so in Western Massachusetts or Central Massachusetts, or frankly, just in Roxbury and Dorchester, Black neighborhoods, predominantly Black neighborhoods in Boston. So how we were connecting up the transportation needs of those communities to the jobs that were growing in Kendall Square or in the medical area was very much top of mind. And some of it was incredibly simple. Like there was a commuter rail, pretty regular schedule that picked up in a suburb just outside of Boston, went right through Roxbury without stopping, and went to South Station downtown. And we said, that makes no sense. And nobody from this neighborhood in Roxbury can get downtown where the jobs are. So we built a stop in Roxbury and required the train to stop there. Simple thing, small thing, something we would not have appreciated if we were just looking at a map, back in the State House, but you get close to people and they tell you what their needs are. And I think that similarly, we did pocket parks. So there were green spaces within about a 15-minute walk of every child in the Commonwealth. A lot of it undeveloped land. This is the last big recession. Undeveloped land. Some of it was public land or land taken in tax takings, for example. Mm-hmm. We created green spaces there, but because the objective was 15 minutes of every child everywhere in the Commonwealth, we were doing the same sort of thing equitably elsewhere, including in rural communities. So it was about trying to be purposeful and intentional, as it sounds like you're trying to be, in striking that balance, and also thinking ahead, as you said. Not every old broken down project, needs to be restored. Sometimes you got to look ahead to, where are people going? Where do they need to be? Where is the affordable housing? Because transportation is part of the answer, not the only answer, but part of the answer to that sort of thing. Is that helpful at all?
It is. Thank you so much. As this region really grows with economic development, those are things that are at the forefront of my mind. So I appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Sure.
We have a lot of questions, so my apologies. I'm going to combine a couple of these. And
I know you can tell me to make them shorter, huh? You want to do
no,
the
it's
lightning
okay. It's
round?
okay. It's fascinating. We're really enjoying it, but we have a lot to get through. So I'm apologizing to the people whose questions I'm combining here. But we have questions about the primary system, political parties, asking about, does the primary system result in more radical candidates being chosen to run? A question about the party leadership, perhaps putting the focus on the court of public opinion, the political mechanisms, they have the funding behind them. Do we need another party? And also, do you see the possibility of independent candidates or third party candidates being more successful in the current environment?
Wow. Okay. Does the primary system drive the radicalization of candidates? Is that kind of it? The primary system, maybe. I think what happens in the primaries, though, is that the activists are the ones paying attention, and I think if more of us paid attention, we get different kinds of outcomes. Or if our candidates were organizing everybody and not just the activists. Organizing the activists is sort of the tried and true way of doing it. I would love it if at the presidential level we did our primaries on a regional basis rather than one in the Midwest and one in New England and then one in the South and then Super Tuesday. I wish. Because I think what it encourages is a lot of this kind of airtime, less so in New Hampshire because of its traditions, but a lot of kind of raising as much money as possible to build relationships with people through 30-second ads, rather than time for the candidate and the candidate's team to actually be on the ground and get close to people. Which brings me to the parties. I think, and I speak more to the Democratic Party. Like I say, I'm a Democrat, but Democrats get on my last nerve, and the party at the national and state level. And I say this not meaning disrespect to the really, really great people who are working in those organizations, but they are stuck on this model of raising money to do ads, stuck on messaging instead of relationships. When I was a kid, my mother was a member of the Young Democrats Club, and it was a social club most of the time, but when they got close to elections, they knew where everybody was, who was doing what, who needed a ride. They had a relationship that was much more grassroots. And there are wonderful local groups doing this work now. And in many cases, and I first really came to appreciate this when I was trying to help out with the midterms in 2018. In Mississippi, in Texas, in Alabama, there were lots of local groups organizing at the grassroots, often just in time rather than permanently, but some of them were permanent. But they were all organizing, and they were, by the way, knit together loosely statewide, but they were all operating outside the Democratic apparatus because the Democratic apparatus wouldn't let them in. Right? They were newcomers. They had a fresh voice. They had a different way of talking and thinking about issues. They had a different view of what the issues were. And I would love to see the parties be more like that, and in particular, the Democratic Party be more like that. Can an independent party or an independent candidate succeed? I just don't know. The history hasn't been good, and the way we organize, the history hasn't been good at the national level, let me put it that way. And the way we organize and frankly even report on elections does not make me hopeful, but I think there is something else people want than they're getting from the parties right now. And as I said about Massachusetts, people aren't buying 100% of what either party is selling anyway. I'll bet most of you don't. I certainly don't.
Great, thank you. We'll take a live question. Ricardo, can unmute yourself.
Hi, Ricardo.
Hi, Governor. Good morning. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Greetings. So I just wanted to ask you, what was your thing that you're most proud of in your time in public service? What was your biggest challenge? And what is an opportunity that you're most looking forward to in the political arena in the next few years?
That I'm most looking forward to?
Yeah.
Man, you trying to get me in trouble with my new gig? Come on. So I am, we had big plans, Ricardo, when I ran, as I think candidates always do. And 15 minutes after I won, the bottom fell out of the global economy, and we were having to make deep cuts and put things on hold and the rest. But I will say that there is opportunity in every crisis. We got some reforms done that would have been hard under normal circumstances. We invested, in some cases, with the help of the stimulus bill that President Obama signed. We're able to keep and enhance some commitments we made, including investing in the public schools at record levels. And in 8 years, we were #1 in America in student achievement. We were #1 in America in healthcare coverage. 98.5% of Massachusetts residents have insurance, and that was before Obamacare. We were #1 in America in entrepreneurship, in veteran services, and energy efficiency. We placed clean tech at the center of our both our environmental justice, but also our economic growth strategy. We came out of recession faster than most other states and achieved a 25-year employment high, and we'd had out migration of young families and of young people and families for, I don't know, maybe 15 years, and we turned that and that turned around because it was a much more, I think, it was a better place to live and work and raise a family. We didn't get everything right, but we got a lot right. I feel really good about that. I think some of the things that make me most proud don't get the most attention. They aren't stats. It was I'm really, really proud of how we handled and recovered from the attack at the marathon, because that was not just law enforcement. That was the business community, that was the not-for-profit community, and the hospitals, the medical folks. It was everyday citizens who showed acts of grace and kindness to others, something I made a point of calling out when we were also reporting on the stats. And I think that idea of turning to rather than on each other by then is something that people understood was about what we were trying to do and what we expected of them. And I think they showed that. They showed an understanding and an appreciation of that, by the way folks behaved in the wake of that tragedy and calamity. It could have easily gone the other way.
And Boston Boston strong governor, by the way. I ran the marathon the year before.
Is that right?
My friends thought I was running that year. So I got 10 calls and everyone's like, where are you? And it's just so sad because it was one of the most beautiful moments in my life.
Yeah.
And I think it was really tough on the marathon community, Boston as a whole. So, what was your first reaction when you heard the news? Where you were like, this is unbelievable, or what happened in the first moments, and how did you keep your head calm, or what was,
Well, I got the news actually from my daughter, I had an unusually open day that day after my duties, crowning the winners. And I crowned them, normally the governor crowns the female elite winner, and the mayor crowns the male elite winner. But the mayor was in the hospital and he'd asked me to do it. I went to see him that morning. And so I did my duties, and they'd come in early, which is why they were elite runners. And I had a free day. I got a haircut and stuff, and got a workout, stuff I didn't usually get to do regularly. And I was on my way home to do some early gardening, and my daughter called, who was a couple blocks away, and she said, "There's a big boom and everybody's running." And I didn't know what it was. And I then got a call from the state police saying, "You better get down here. Something's happened." They didn't know if it was a manhole cover that had exploded or what. And I think, the back and forth with the state police about whether even to go, because it's interesting. Today, we think of two bombs, two bombers, and we found, these two terrorist needles in a haystack in 100 hours. For most of that week, we didn't know what was going on. We didn't know how wide a plan this was, how much danger people were in or might have been. There was just a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And everybody wants to be busy, but no one actually wants to lead because it could go, sideways. And what was interesting to me, I think, about that time was how, because I will say it's not clear that the governor actually has authority in a situation like that, but there was a vacuum, and because we'd all worked together on other emergencies and we had some practice, it came together. It came together well. But I think that mostly I was I still am struck by just how little we knew when we were having to make decisions, but that's a conversation for another time.
Well, thank you so much for answering my question, and thank you for your service and your leadership.
Thank you.
Boston strong.
Boston strong.
Thank you so much. We are just about at time, so I'm going to ask one more question from Elisa, who wants to know how we can better incentivize servant leadership in both the public and private sectors.
You know what? I think it is there are probably, and as I try to dig into this academically, probably structures and processes, but I think there's something else we can do, which is to lift up those examples. When the servant leaders, first of all, you can behave that way. You can be about others. I have found that old lesson about whatever you give, you get back in multiples. It's deep in scripture. It comes from my family and from my faith tradition. It turns out to be true. It's not just a nice thing. And it comes back in so many different ways when you need it, not necessarily when you want it. I think we can acknowledge those kinds of leaders. We can find and support those sorts of leaders. And by the way, when people are faking when they aren't. When they're saying the words and they don't really mean. This is the thing about politics that blows my mind. People read a fraud every time, but candidates still play the game. And we should call out people and test their authenticity, and we should pay attention to and encourage the ones who are authentic to step on out there in an arena, whether it's political or the public sector or the private sector, where they may think there isn't room for them, that they don't fit. But what you do to encourage that kind of leader to come forward and vie for that promotion in a company, to volunteer to be the head of that special committee in the private sector, or to run for that local office or more, and that you will work to support that person and have that person's back, not just say, I like what I see, now you go do it, but that we will do this. This will be our undertaking. I think that's how we get more servant leaders, and how we replace the alternative with servant leaders.